So from those sort of fictional correspondences and performances, we'll go into the real life conversation. So I guess if we could start off by talking, to bring it back to, 2 years ago, about your initial preoccupations and interest in the theme, What Will They See of Me? How those interests led towards the udder and the extras ever moving lips, and maybe how the current works continue or depart from those interests.
Go on, Marianna. You don't, I'm sorry, that was like a terrible move.
It seemed to strike a chord to do with the gaze of species looking at each other. And I was reading, someone's going to have to help me remember the name, about Derrida and his cat looking at each other. But I was also making a work called Dog at the time for my degree piece at the Slade. And it was, in it, I invited an elderly woman to play the part of my dog. In a dog training session, which we then documented, and I enveloped into another narrative. And I had problems with my own piece in that I was looking at the soppy eyes of this creature and finding a kind of empathetic relationship with it. And so I wanted to destroy this kind of soppy viewership that I think relates to the self as well, and trying to identify with something that is looking at how we operate on a larger scale, how others are indifferent to their own manufacturing process, and what they are, both as a sort of identifiable subject, but also a producer of consumable products that we all share and know. So that was my kind of entry point, going from animals and trying to do away with the animal and take an organ and actually try to make that in some way correspondent to what we know as us. It's quite a long time.
I will say this thing, but I also am really aware that it's probably a lie, because I can't remember what I was thinking at the beginning of that thing. But I imagine that it was about performance and liveness. Like I used to make performance. That was the thing I did. Made performance for maybe 5 years, and I have always been interested in what that live moment might do, and what the if. I think I was thinking about if the invention of the camera invented liveness, then the invention of technology that allows a Skype or a chat to happen simultaneously, then that reimagines liveness, right? And it does something or describes something, a new possibility in what an interaction might be. So I guess I was thinking about that a lot. And in that first film that I made, which is in there, called The Extras Ever Moving Lips, I was really, I guess I was embedded in thinking about stories within a family, about what a repeated story is and the trap of a repeated story, and about being held to your word, which both seems like a trick that technology might allow, but really, when I'm thinking about that trick, so in that work, it's the piece of a necessarily disposable soap, which has been pickled via digitization and can be watched long past its imagined lifespan. But I was really thinking about that as, it could seem like a new possibility, but maybe it isn't at all, because it relates so strongly to the memory that a family has of you, the story that repeats itself, the inability to move away from this thing that wasn't even you, that thing often being yourself as a child, which has no relation to you anymore.
So we see in the first film the mediation of maybe the original live performance, and that definitely seems a preoccupation. from our own correspondent. And I guess if you could both talk about the links between the films, I guess it's more strong, maybe more of a kind of continued narrative of love.
Yeah, it was. I was looking at medieval notions of chastity and how one must be put through an ordeal in order to prove something as evidence of being virtuous or having some kind of notion of purity. And the aspects of contaminations of personality and identity follow through from something in roboticism of agriculture and how things are becoming technologized there. The preventative measures of others, you know, trying to not get mastitis, which will heavily affect the farms and commerce, through to a sort of more of a crisis of identity contamination, whereby within the very individual you're having to confront messy, you know, trying to kind of do away with a binary sense of gender, which the other voice is, I think, initially. So chastity, mastitis, purity, contamination, I'm just flinging words out, but it's all in there in both works, for sure.
Between the two works, there's something about a loop and there's something about language being being a performed and slippy thing, which is, you know, a basic observation and a basic observation that runs through all of my work. It's funny, when we were setting up this show, we were talking about which work should go in it and whether both iterations should be in the same thing. I just oscillated between thinking they're exactly the same work. In my head it feels like, I can't believe I just made that same work twice, and then the feeling of like they've got nothing to do with each other. And even now they're in the space, it feels like either they're identical twins or they are screaming madnesses in a different direction. Like, so yeah.
I mean, with the case of our own correspondence, it sort of feels like it's the written speech and correspondence of the avatar that we're left with. You know, we don't hear her speaking, only really a mediated, sort of recorded over processed monologue. So I was wondering how you see those short messages of correspondence as functioning.
I hadn't thought of her. I mean, I thought that was her voice. Like, I definitely thought that was her voice. That's just how she is. She's a little bit like, she's a bit Cody. But there's little snippets. I wanted these things that they go outside the windows, and I was trying to think of her imagining herself outside the space or talking about attempting to break the edges of the space. So yeah, I mean, they're descriptions of her wants, and her wants having to be expressed via describing herself in a way.
It feels like the private, intimate language of the film. So I was wondering how that's also working or playing off the seemingly public, professionalised language of the interviewees / interviewers. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, in a way, they're both very formal languages. Her description of herself, this 37-year-old woman, brunette, whatever. In terms of those digital utopians, there's something about internet sex or internet meeting, which both has that potential of freedom and access and a kind of ethical meeting of needs at a certain point. But simultaneously, there's like a lot of just really basic descriptions of categories of self, which are and so I wanted to have those contradictions of I mean, it's funny, it took me in a weird way, they were the hardest part of the film to work out what those little snippets could be, because I wanted, whenever they were more explicit than that, whenever they said what she wanted, or they were too depressing in their prescription of what she was. So I mean, in a way, they're the beginning of a conversation in quite a similar way, I imagine, to the interviews, which might turn into something else, but probably will be very transactional and basic, and but they're an expression of a desire, the opening up of a conversation, which I really think is meant to be a parallel to what the interviewers are doing.
Yeah, and that kind of opening up a conversation, and the kind of the relationship between the spoken and the non-spoken, thinking about the quite kind of like formative scene on the bridge in Blood, where Isabel's sort of asking Lally questions, kind of testing her sort of sense of identity and subjectivity, and also just the way she dresses, her public appearance. So I was wondering how you see that spoken and non-spoken language operating, how they communicate in a way.
What was the non-spoken? Sorry, you mean the invisible,
Yeah,
understood language that is not spoken because it's been translated off screen? Yeah, it sort of relates to another notion of Isabel being constantly on and off in a real and an unreal space simultaneously. Same way that language is both understood and not understood at the same time. In a miraculous sense that film can do that real life can't, which is why I like to employ these tricks that are not meant to deceive the viewer in their construction, but they're quite clearly someone has to have been there to make that scene occur. So I hope that's clear. But maybe in a radical sense, I think of it as an emptying out of Isabel being almost nearly corpse-like, actually, in knowing that she's voluntarily gone into this operation that is then potentially she could destroy her, her life or or maybe her face from, which I'm thinking on the spot, but maybe relates to a language as a sort of like a non-language or a kind of empty language that is not there but is understood somehow from this position of near death or absence.
And that's how they're because they've got a very kind of unusual kinship in a way.
Yeah.
And maybe that's how.
And that was actually very genuine, and Lally prides herself on being able to be understood. And I was talking to you about her being part of this action movement during the beginning of communism, and being a man and being able to work and build the train lines and do this thing, and it's all about straight lines. And she was really not into zigzags, and she'd talk about these lines and these gestures of directed speech that you must look everybody in the eye when you talk to them. I'm trying to do it now. But, and that's part of who she is, and that's why when she says to Isabel, look at me in the eye, even through her hallucination, she looks right at the camera and we have to confront the gaze straight on. So that's really who Lally is, quite genuinely.
I'm kind of interested in these kind of these background conversations that you've had with Lally, and working with the translator and non-actors, and I guess if you could talk about the process of writing the script, of kind of like layering different kind of aspects of experience together.
Yeah, I have brought along a couple of lines from Milton, and it's just because I don't ever talk about this, but something about Milton is in the work, in both pieces, and where the little turbinate bones are clinging onto the nose that has just, where Isabel's just got rid of them. It sounds a bit wanky, I know, but it sort of makes sense. It's when Satan, there's a little bit in Paradise Lost, when Satan is he's barred away from heaven by his own illegitimate daughter, who called Sin, who has given birth to death through sleeping with her father. So he says, hast thou forgot me then, and do I seem now in thine eye so foul, once deemed so fair in heaven, and later with me in secret that my womb conceived a growing burden. And so the burden of the nose is almost of this sort of satanic origin, which I was reading. So there's that kind of very lush, almost, over the top literature that I go to, and then there's a sort of more conversational approach where it's about going to Albania for 3 weeks, just jumping on a bus and going around and trying to find these sworn virgins, of which I know nothing about. And it really does oscillate between trying to freak out about my lack of knowledge and then bury myself in it and then pull myself away again and just think, no, the world's okay, we can just talk to each other and make something of that. So that's my process, really. Yeah.
In terms of how you've used the Emma Eckstein narrative and the historical narrative within this kind of like fictional arena in a way, how do you see that that kind of appropriation is playing out kind of in relation to your using the Sworn Virgin very real life tradition?
Yeah, in that it's obsolete or gone,
or how those two speak to one another.
It's through the way that Isabel is able to then voice Freud's thought of what you were talking about, Josh, about his description of his going into this limp mode, this descent, and how Isabel is able to re-narrativize somebody else's. This is quite confusing because she's looking at herself bleeding. So in the film, she's behind herself. She's not even experiencing it. She's very with it, actually. And so this description of the hysterical, out of control, unthinking woman is actually completely it's mocking that in a way. It's being very, very particular and observant on the situation whilst living it through. So in relation to Lally, I think that she's equally knows that she has to keep this oath or else she might die because she's chosen to live as a man. It's about acknowledgement. It's basically about being able to be both hysterical and objective at the same time, I think. And I think that that is somehow contained within the body of Lally.
Mm-hmm. It feels like Isabel's illness and her kind of experience of that illness is kind of, she's not sort of static, she's not passive. It's kind of almost, it's some kind of state in which she can experience change or transgress in some way.
Yeah, or like her body does it. Her voice doesn't so much as her. I think her body does it because she's described by her own mother as a different child, and that she laughs at her own daughter because she doesn't care what she's put through. And I like that when I found her as a character, because I was talking to someone here earlier about it being acquiescing to its own instrument, its own milking process. It doesn't have a desire or lack of desire. It's just indifferent to its own process. Scientists say. Sorry, I've gone off.
And thinking about narrative in From Our Own Correspondent, how there's seems to be kind of three kind of sections, and I guess how you see those kind of narratives of the film interrelating. And how you could describe maybe those three.
Yeah, so there's three sections in the work. There's a bit where the avatar, this animated woman, I don't know if she is an avatar, this animated woman kind of sits around in hotel rooms with her, either she's taken her skirt off or she's waiting to get dressed, and she's doing these, performing these gestures that might be the other side of an interview. So she's doing this nodding and this looking and this being concerned, and I kind of thought of her as both performing, she's rehearsing and going over at the same time. She's waiting and she's done. And there's the middle section, which are these interviews with these various American female journalists, asking them questions about interviewing as a job and how they do that. And there's a third, which is this the animated character lying on a bed in this stuttering time, telling this story, giving this monologue about coming across coming across as was described earlier, the text from a scandal being reinvigorated or something in a chat room. It took me a really long time to realise that they need to loop more, that they're a loop, they're like 3 equal sections that I hope can be rearranged in a way. I feel like I'm being really avoidant, but I don't mean to be.
Yeah, sorry.
Please.
I guess in terms of like they're all playing into a sense of what we make visible or what we choose to kind of hold back in a way.
Yeah.
Specifically probably in language. And I guess I was interested in the process of you doing it as well, and how your experience of offering yourself interviewing these journalists.
Well, there's kind of, I mean, that's something that hangs over the whole work as well, whether it is a we or it is a they. I guess I was thinking a lot about the idea of a story and about these journalists who are attempting to they speak to someone else and they attempt to find something that can be removed, that can be put together and neatly taken somewhere else, and which is what the last thing is, which is what the monologue is, and that both is a mode of like a pleasurable thing, but simultaneously a bit fascist, just as my use of these women, my use of them as to build a mild, slight argument about something or other, to use their voices to make my point, is natural, but iffy as well. So, yeah,
You talked a bit about in the past about what kind of like being the bad interviewer or your amateurism.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted American journalists. I wanted these women who are, well, both in the mind of a British audience, but in the mind of a British audience, professionals. But I wanted these eloquent people who would just be able to talk about this stuff. And actually, they vary. But there's the woman with the red hair is so able to be self-reflexive. And then I come, and obviously that isn't my job, and I don't speak smoothly, and that is my inability to speak smoothly runs through all the work as well. And so I'm confronting these people in these hotel rooms with what, the question about what my intention is hangs over all of it, I think, hung over those meetings. And so their generosity or lack of generosity, their imagining of what I want, became really a strong part of that language. But yeah, I'm an amateur, and they tell me off. Like in it, there's a slight bit I wish I could put in, but it's too name droppy as well as simultaneously telling off. But they tell me off and they instruct me, and they can't quite bear to be around me at certain points as well. And I feel like that persistence, me trying to hold on to these conversations has managed to textually seep into the work. I feel it's, again, this is only my own interpretation, but I feel the idea that they are slightly doing me a favour, that they're that it's a little too long, it's not quite tight enough, is a description of a conversation that I'm much more interested in. And my unprofessionalism is what brings that out, though of course, like, this is literally my job.
And of course it's kind of it's the kind of middle section of a kind of beginning of the day and the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so these women aren't working like 9 to 5. There's no kind of structured units of time. And so I was wondering how you see the film engaging with modes of time in a way that might be sort of relentless or affected by a breakdown in kind of like one work and non-work times, or and how that's kind of impacted by technology.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely part of it. I guess it relates a lot to being an artist and doing exactly something like this, where there's an anxiety where there's an anxiety of contemporary working where it feels like you could always destroy your work, you could always destroy what you're about to do, and in destroying that there's like a shame that's been touched on in various things over the day, but there's also like there's an economic relationship to that as well, where if you don't check your emails at night, if you don't reply soon enough, if you don't perform correctly, there's always this how you might live when you're always close to fucking up via your performance of self, by not making the right decisions, is it's a tension I'm really interested in, and I mean it's a thing that I'm interested in life, and there's and like a lot of the people you talked about, like the Kathy Acker, like who are seem very relevant at the moment, but are still the difference between enjoying those performances and seeing the like radical potential of that stuff and then being able to do it is really different. The difference between that as a life and a quote is really huge, and I think
In terms of blood as well, the film kind of seems a bit sort of, there's a sort of suspension of time in a way in terms of the hallucinations, which kind of some sort of functions in a kind of fairy tale like way. If you could
fairy tales, yeah,
and you mentioned the Brothers Grimm to me in the past, and that kind
and
of
the Willful Child,
yeah.
which is a really good example of a type of protest or persistent protest, which I think Sarah Ahmed talks about, this persisting arm that comes out of the grave, this little arm which can't be cured without the switch of the mother beating it back down, and then it is at peace. It's a ridiculously dark story and awful, but it's really haunted me. And fairy tales are useful in that I don't like the prettiness of them, actually. I don't really like the comfort that they bring, but what they do have is these archetypes that you can then destroy. And that's probably what draws me to them, is that they're stories that we already know. I think I want to tell stories that we feel we already know, and they just need a bit of reparation or modification, but they're not new things, and they come out of some kind of, I'm using stories going back to the 1200s through to 100 years ago with the Eckstein case, and time is a sort of long lineage for me. I don't really look at the internet as something that is separate from any of that, so that's probably where that interest comes from, in looking and having a historical relationship to art and art making.
And it feels very pertinent to kind of blood and the kind of the metaphors that we kind of might associate with blood. There seems to be there's a sort of model of abjection going on, but there's also this kind of notion of currency and blood that might be something that can be exchanged.
Yeah, and bloodlessness as well. I indulged in the prosthetics of this film in having blood, but it was important that the big hemorrhage scene was not a kind of Dexter splashing moment. It was meant to be cold and felt, because you could touch it and it wouldn't leak, and it was as material. It was an object, albeit with holes and transparencies. So it was important that the blood was not as visceral as one might think of when thinking of the title. Actually, it was a kind of a deadening, empty blood, a technologized blood, maybe.
We have these scenes of kind of like a sort of polyester artifice and kind of played off against the hallucinations being kind of much more documentary in style. Was that a kind of was that a kind of sort of staging of some kind of like fictional construct, or how did those kind of, what did the reasoning come from that?
I mean, it doesn't matter so much after the film's made, but in making the film you have to have a logic, because otherwise it all falls apart and destroys itself. So my logic was that the exterior world, which is the real world, which is the Isabel that is constantly erupting, is reality in the polyester artificial land. And then her hallucinations happen in a more documentary setting. And so I wanted to invert a sort of, I suppose my interest in cinema and filmic language, where you're expected to go down a trippy route into some gaga land where you're, you know, out of your senses, and actually I wanted her to be very much in her senses when she was hallucinating. So that's why that model kind of keeps on. It's that I can't really work out what's real and what's not, because you want to destroy the boundaries of both in a way.
And perhaps that's relevant to the kind of, we see these artificial characters of the Avatar in From Our Own Correspondence, have the real life characters kind of seemingly in performance, and then we have, they're kind of using language as a kind of artificial, slightly automated substance in a way, and they're placed in these, and then we have this kind of hotel room set. So I was wondering how you could talk about the aesthetic and the usage of those hotel rooms.
I wanted them as these places of various fantasies where they, as someone said earlier, they're both these blanks that seem full of potential, and an ultimate contemporary space that would be able to fit your domestic life and your work life, and are empty enough to allow all these things to happen, but actually a body within those is often the space consumes the body fairly quickly. The body becomes this grubby object in the middle of it, just ruffling the smoothness of the bed, or putting their hairs in the sink. And so at basis they were a site to problematize an actual physicality. But I was thinking about them and all the many performances of that might happen in the hotel. And
within that, the Avatar, if we, I guess, could talk about maybe the sources behind her construction, and what she stands for in a way. Is she kind of a stand-in for these characters, or is she kind of a kind of separate identity?
Yeah, I started to think of her as an example, and then I remembered she is an example in the way that she's this 37-year-old brunette with a job, and she's wearing work-appropriate clothes, and has a semi-practical hairdo, she's also a description of a woman going through the process of invisibleness that happens to women. And yet she's been asked for this other invisibleness on top of it, which involves her abdication in order to make something. And so I'm interested in her as a description of how abdication might allow someone to make something, and the political ramifications of that for a woman. But yeah, she's from, I think I said this to you, she's from the next catalogue. She's from clothes that you can dress up or down. She's a lot of women who've been my bosses over the years, and she's from my own internalized misogyny.
It results in a kind of like flattening of character in a way.
Yeah.
And there definitely seems kind of something cyborg, machine-like in her kind of construction, but also the way her gestures and the way she moves.
Yeah. There is, but also she's the bit that I have most control over. She's the bit where every one of her gestures is like, no, it's not like that. It's like place like that. It's not. It's where the lip has to be more still than that, or where the lip has to be thinner than that. Where the so she's both. She is empty, but she's filled entirely by me. Whereas everything else is a prop, right? Everything else is a ready-made. Whereas she is mine.
She kind of we see her sort of kind of half exposed and open, and similarly Isabel is kind of exposed in her illness and messy and bloody and leaking. So I guess a kind of like open question of how, whether these kind of female archetypes are kind of, are they, you see their disruptive potential in a way.
Could you rephrase it just again?
Seeing whether the women in the film, in their kind of wrongness in a way, maybe, offer up an alternative.
Yeah, I think
in terms of gender identity.
Yeah, I mean, she's wearing the horror on her face, and I think that I feel like I come from a place of horror actually, in relation to gender, something that I only just noticed, and I noticed it through my work because I'm in a fortunate place now where my work can think for me and I can have a dialogue with it. And I think that after making maybe 4 or 5 pieces, that can begin to happen. So questions of gender are now ever present. I mean, having made this work, and I notice it down the street, and I notice myself feeling repulsed by things, and more and more and more, and it attacks me as much as I talk about it in the work. It's actually affecting me as a woman wanting to be repulsive, and Isabel revolts by being revolting, right? So her kind of way of being is actually through showing how ugly she can be and being like, up yours, yeah, and what, and it's great, and she can just travel through imagining a world where you can have everything whilst, I don't know, she's an idealist model really, where she's actually able to acknowledge both the good and the bad and wear it brutally. So I don't know, I'm figuring it out for sure. It's not an answer that's complete.
Yeah, I don't know if I think that it's, I mean, there's a bit of that work that is, there's a resistance in just presenting her body, but I don't know if there's a resistance in like just the images of these women, I think, but yeah, I don't know if it, I don't know if it
but we
does
have
much more than that.
There's always a kind of multiplicity going on, I guess, like whether you're performing in your work and you're not, and you're performing at home, and likewise we have Lally kind of performing her gender and performing her identity, and that you can kind of always be a she and a he, and you don't need a personal pronoun, and you can kind of be anything at once, which definitely Blood seems to kind of suggest, and in lots of ways Farmer and Correspondent does too.
Yeah, I mean, but also that maybe you wouldn't know, you would just be, the subject wouldn't know, and they wouldn't be the author of it either. That there is a gap and a lack of agency as well.
How are we doing for time? 5 minutes. Okay. Thinking about the like, I guess, the striving for a kind of a language of intimacy in Farmer and Correspondent, and particularly the section at the end in which she's kind of searching for contact online, and I guess I was wondering how that, whether that's kind of it's suggestive of desire, but it's also suggestive of kind of distraction and a kind of like filling up time just before she goes to bed.
Like, I think that's, mean, it's kind of weird for me to talk about it like this, but I think she's kind of happy there. Like, she's just, like, the distraction and pleasure seem like absolutely, as good a thing as any one of us could hope for. And there's something about her stillness that I think is, relates to pleasure, and she there's, I guess, that she has found some intimacy in this response, in this, the knowledge she could reply to this, that she is feeling something from this other person's actions, and this other person's action has time, and she can read into it. Like, there's enough, and that's.
In the sense that this is the kind of same rehearsal, this same performance that she's kind of reenacting in a way will maybe just happen again tomorrow.
Well, I think it would have to be something new. That's the thing. But there's enough. I think intimacy is often a very slight thing and a slight pleasure, but is I guess something that runs through that whole work is how much you need from someone else, how much you need them to reply to your questions and bring what you hoped they would bring, or how much they might bring something else. Both of which being about your own desires and whether a person can, how much you need someone else for say a team within those things. And I guess that's the point where she is getting just a little rub of something else.
And Bessa in Albania, I first read it as just a kind of care, and then Esther mentioned kind of hospitality, but their relationship also feels very intimate in a way.
Bessa doesn't mean care, it's violent, it's more like honour, and to break it would mean death, so it's not, it's care and hospitality, but it's with everything at stake, so you have someone in your Bessa, and then like you can't you can't ask for, you don't even necessarily ask for the name like you were saying, you just take into the home. And I left it as untranslated because I'm struggling right now to even translate it, and the only way I could understand it is by having multiple conversations with multiple families and having meals and asking about sworn virgins, and then experiencing the shame of my question being directed at these families, and then other people being proud, and finding the whole thing very, very confusing at first.
Your shame or their shame?
Their shame in the discussion of gender and sexuality at the dinner table. It was just weird, but that's the only time I saw them as well, because they would scuttle off as an invisible host and and so I'd try to navigate my way through this situation by having to be quite forceful at times and ask the translator, no, say it this way, this is what I'm asking, don't try to cover everything and make everything polite. And it was just really difficult to get straightforward meanings of things.
Yeah, and do you feel like, was that the main difficulty in kind of almost kind of taking on some of that responsibility for them?
Yeah. Them being the sworn virgins, or the
tradition.
Yeah. I think that is a huge part of an anxiety of even going into a kind of anthropological way of making that is embedded, or looking in. And thankfully there's a mutuality that I'm trying to get at between these two characters that is not about pouncing or observing without feeling also that you're being opened up from the inside at the same time. So yeah.